Okay, you want a rhetorical question? How's this one? Is there a problem with political correctness on our campuses? Dr. Gatsad is a professor of marketing. He's at Concordia, and he's the author of The Consuming Instinct: What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature. But we're here to talk about what's happening on campuses south of the border and on this side of the border as well. The rise of political correctness on campus. Good morning, Professor. Nice to see you again. What examples have you seen of political correctness that have shocked you or surprised you?
Oh, you've got about 6 hours?
Yeah, well, no, I'm only here till noon, but let's see what you can do.
Recently, Richard Dawkins, the eminent evolutionary biologist, was disinvited from a conference because he retweeted a clip that was satirizing the similarity between Islamists and feminists. And the mere fact that he retweeted that link got him disinvited. This is Richard Dawkins. So that would be one example of a billion.
Now, you're saying this is happening, that's one example. I've heard many examples of what's going on in the United States. Is it coming here? Is it coming to Canada on campus?
Right. So the old expression that when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold is exactly operative here. In the U.S., it's on steroid, and slowly we're seeing the incursion of this lunacy on Canadian campuses indeed.
When did you first start to notice it?
I would say probably about 10 years ago. You started seeing a sense of entitlement among some students, sort of a culture of offense, a culture of victimology, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And one of the reasons why I speak out against it is because we need to, revert the ship back to its proper course.
Now, this culture of offense and victimology, I mean, it's not changing. I mean, people are saying they want a safe space. They don't want to hear another opinion. Now, I don't understand, because when I was at university, you had the left and you had the right, and they agreed on some things and disagreed on most things, but neither tried to shut down the other one from speaking.
Right.
What changed?
Well, I think what's happened is that intellectual diversity that you just alluded to is almost non-existent in many campuses. There was a great study that was done a few years ago that looked at, in the United States, the percentage of professors who are either affiliated with the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. And across disciplines, it was 5-1 in the favor of Democrats. But in certain disciplines, some of the most vociferous sort of activist disciplines, sociology and women's studies and so on, you had up to 44-1 ratio. Now, that's not going to promote intellectual diversity, and it's going to, if anything, instill an echo chamber.
But I mean, some of this goes back quite a long time. I remember doing this myself and telling the children of my friends to do it. In other words, that they're doing any essay for any professor, always to defend the left-wing point of view and never to defend the right-wing point of view. And don't say anything against climate change at all, or you're going to get a bad mark, no matter how good the paper is. Does that still apply?
I mean, I don't see it in my particular courses because my courses are not ideological based, but certainly from stories that I hear from other people. I mean, I get emails from students who exactly enunciate the position that you're saying, because they're afraid that if they say something that might be contrary to the ideological position espoused by the professor, they might receive a bad grade. It's grotesque.
So if anyone were to say that it's not really a patriarchy, it's a matriarchy, and present the reasons why, they're going to fail, right?
I'm not sure if they'll fail, but certainly
they won't get a good mark.
With some professors, indeed, that would be the case.
Your questions for my guest, Dr. Gatsad. He's a professor of marketing at Concordia University, about political correctness on campus. What's a microaggression?
So a microaggression is any inane thing that you could think of that somebody can construe as offensive in some way. And so if you say that in the United States, if you work hard, you will succeed, apparently UCLA, I believe, has decided that that's a microaggression, maybe because it is ableist. So I mean, it's literally gotten to the point where it is a satire. Anything that you say, oh, are you originally from the United States? If you ask that question, because the person looks like they are a visible minority from some other land, that itself would be a microaggression, because how dare you sort of delegitimize my identity?
All right. Now, first of all, this business about, I can understand and sympathize that somebody might be offended by that question. So that's okay. So now they're offended. And There's lots of things that'll happen during the course of the day. Some things will make you feel good. Some things you'll be offended, and you go on with your day. I mean, isn't that the way it should be?
Right. Well, I think that's exactly it. You're infantilizing life, basically, right? I mean, for those of you that some of the readers who may not know my personal history, I mean, we escaped the Lebanese Civil War. We escaped execution. That's trying to escape and head to a safe space called Canada. But when now everybody infantilizes every possible faux pas, in some cases not even a faux pas, you're making a mockery of daily interactions.
My guest is Professor Gatsad. This texter wants to know how much are professors and faculty responsible for the PC culture by pushing their agendas and by cultivating the culture of grievance mongering.
Well, in fields that are, as I said, very much sort of activism laden, I would certainly place part of the blame on the professors because they like to have an echo chamber. I mean, in fields such as in engineering or in biology, it's a lot more difficult to push an activism agenda. But in sociology and in women's studies and in humanities and so on, this is where you get some of the sort of more egregious cases of brainwashing.
This texter, this listener saying, Tommy, I love when you speak about this. It's very disturbing. As a person of color myself, I want the discourse. I want the person to say why they think some races are superior. I want to disagree. I want to argue. I know for a fact that ISIS doesn't have to worry about taking over the world. We're raising adults who are soft, full of anxiety, and oversensitive. Your guest is absolutely right. Well, so it's not a matter of all minorities feel this way at all. Like in this case, this woman who's a member, a minority, a person of color, she doesn't like the idea.
So I'll give her some people that she could follow who are also people of color. Larry Elder, who is also known as the Sage of LA, is a black gentleman who despises these types of movements. Thomas Sowell, a black conservative economist, is another one that you might want to check out. So yeah, it's absolutely the case that it's not only the white patriarchy that imposes these types of stupidities.
Very good question from this listener. Why are female teachers always allowed to take up class time to express their feminist views, but male teachers are often placed in some weird position where they can't be against feminism and at the same time look dumb by supporting it?
I mean, I can't speak to the particular case. I could tell you that if in certain classes, I mean, if you go into a women's studies class, if you simply say that there are innate sex differences, that itself would be heresy. So the idea that all sex differences are socially constructed is what is de rigueur in a women's studies program. So yeah, you take a lot of risks by going against the feminist talking points.
This texter saying, I love the sad truth. This speaker, amazing. Check out his talk on the subject at the University of Ottawa. Thanks for having him on, Mr. Sad. Thank you for speaking out.
Thank you.
Another listener is very worried about microaggressions. He says, if I may be permitted without causing a microaggression, I believe
I feel offended already.
What you're trying to say throughout this interview is that we no longer have the right to be wrong. We're going to continue our discussion about the patriarchy, the matriarchy, microaggression, political correctness, and cultural Marxism. What's cultural Marxism? We're going to get to that in a moment as well. My guest is Dr. Gatsad. He is a professor of marketing at Concordia University right here in Montreal, the author of The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Join the conversation, 514-790-0800. You can give us give us a call, or you can text your message, your comment, your question to 514-800. Dr. Gatsad is my guest. He's a professor of marketing at Concordia University, author of The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Shall we go to the phones? 514-790-0800. Oh, look at that. Stan's on the line. Good morning, Stan. Do you have a question?
Yes, good morning, Tommy. I'd like to ask the professor, in reference to microaggression, does it refer only, which I presume, to perceived slights on the left? For example, if I'm a student at any university campus in North America, and I'm offended, for example, by Israel Apartheid Week on campus, can I claim microaggression and have Israel Apartheid Week stopped?
I mean,
good question. Thank you.
Well, the vernacular of microaggressions is typically coming from leftists, precisely because they are the ones who are typically the most frequent ones on campus. So no, it hasn't typically been associated with a right perspective. And probably you'd be unpopular if you try to take the position that you have on some campuses in Canada when it comes to Israel.
As a professor of marketing, this texter wants to know from Vancouver, please explain the pathology of duping college students into supporting dysfunctional ideologies.
But give me an example of a dysfunctional
Well,
ideology.
he didn't have one. Another texter saying, please ask Professor SAAD to explain the Ostrich Brigade and how your crusade to embolden them is going.
Yeah, so the ostrich brigade is a term that I popularized that refers to people who put their head in the proverbial sand and try to avoid certain basic realities that are as clear as the existence of gravity. So, for example, to never want to associate any violent acts globally with anything to do with Islamic doctrines is an instantiation of the Ostrich Brigade. Obviously, many Muslims are kind and peaceful, but to deny the fact that there might be a link between Islamic doctrines and the motivation of some terrorists is a form of ostrich logic.
This texter wants to know, this listener wants to know, how bad are things at York University for Jewish students? Are Jews made to feel uncomfortable at York or any other universities in Canada?
About a week ago, I received a very long letter from a Jewish student saying that he feels very, very threatened at my university. Threatened in some cases physically, but also from taking certain positions, like the question that was asked earlier regarding, the divestment stuff.
So why doesn't the right or the middle take the same point? Say, no, this is not I do not feel in a safe space. This is a microaggression that I have to put up with this, and I want the university to guarantee me a safe space. The left is not shy about demanding that.
Right.
Why doesn't
Well, I think it's just a question of numbers. As I said earlier, I mean, if you've got faculty proportions that are 44 to 1, then you're not going to have a sympathetic ear to your concerns if you're coming from a position that is not the popular one.
This text is saying, not only happening in campuses, I noticed a large increase in political correctness in the media in the last decade.
And I mean, just go on Twitter. I mean, there's a million cases where somebody who has a very, very successful career will tweet something that's a bit idiotic, and then there'll be an e-mob that's trying to ruin their careers because they wrote something that was perhaps a bit silly. That's grotesque.
When you teach your classes, Professor, do you ever give out trigger warnings?
Well, I've started giving a trigger warning in a satirical manner. Basically, I say that trigger warning, life is a trigger warning, right? If you've got a functioning brain, you're going to be exposed to certain unpleasant realities and, grow a pair and get over it. But frankly, I haven't personally experienced a lot of these troubles in my classes, frankly, and not to be sweet. Most of my students have been very reasonable. I'm speaking about the general sort of atmosphere that's found across campuses.
Well, let's talk about the trigger warnings in the United States. I've heard cases of Ivy League universities where professors have to give a trigger warning if they're teaching Romeo and Juliet because of suicide, because of violence, because of trauma within that play.
Right. Well,
and I double-checked to make sure it wasn't from the Onion. It wasn't. It's really happening.
So if people go and check my recent talk at the University of Ottawa, where I spoke about political correctness, I listed the range of topics that now necessitate trigger warnings. It's pretty much everything under the sun. I mean, anything that you could... pregnancy, consensual sex, war, crime.
So if you're going to talk about any of this in a classroom, you have to warn the students
anything, medical
in advance.
procedures, anything, right? I mean, so literally anything that I would talk about as an evolutionary scientist would probably necessitate a trigger warning.
So with medical procedures, does this mean the student can opt out? In other words, that they hear this trigger warning, this is just going to traumatize them, so they have to leave the class. Can they opt out of it and still continue the class and still get a good mark?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that they could opt out of the course, but it's that, you're being empathetic as a professor by warning people that there might be material that might make them feel uncomfortable. So in the same way that, let's say you've got a commercial on TV about animal abuse, and I think it is correct to say, hey, if you're worried about these issues, turn away now.
Right.
They've taken this original good idea and put it on steroid, and it becomes very difficult to have a discussion of anything because everything could trigger somebody on something.
So would the best way to handle it is to have a long list, as you said you put together, and have a professor read this at the beginning of each class. One of these things might come up during the class: life, cesarean section, pregnancy, right?
Or
rape, violence, war, all of the, right? Just list them all.
Or don't acquiesce and say that trigger warnings are a bunch of BS and teach university students that they're adults. Life has unpleasantries, and so no, there will be no trigger warnings in my classes.
But are there serious concerns about this? This listener is saying that Ezra Levant's run-in with Alberta's Human Rights Commission cost him $100,000 in legal fees.
Well, he's talking about these hate speech tribunals. Yeah, can I go on?
Yeah, sure.
Where basically anybody can levy a charge of hate speech against you. It's antithetical to free speech.
Peter on the line with a question. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Excellent commentary. Very quickly, what are the top 3 or 4 most politically correct universities in Canada?
A great question.
I don't know the ranking. At the University of Ottawa lecture that I gave, I discussed a study that ranks 55 Canadian universities in terms of how they score on freedom. And so you could check that report and, you could decide on your own ranking. I don't know it off the top of my head, but most universities in Canada don't score very well on these metrics.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gatsat, Professor of Marketing at Concordia, author of The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature.